You walked away thinking silence would end the story. But for a narcissist, silence is where the real game begins. And what they do in your absence is far more calculated than you ever imagined. Let me tell you something clearly from the start. Choosing no contact with a narcissist is one of the most difficult yet powerful decisions you will ever make. If you're listening to this, it likely means you've already stepped away or you're standing at the edge of that decision. But here's the truth most people don't realize. Just because you've ended things doesn't mean the story is over for them. When you go silent, it doesn't end the game in their mind. It often begins a different phase of it. Because narcissists don't simply detach and move on. They don't respect boundaries in the way healthy people do. Instead, they observe, they calculate, they wait, and their silence is never accidental. It's not acceptance. It's not healing. It's strategy. Today, I want to lift the curtain on what's really happening behind the scenes, the 7 hidden things a narcissist quietly wants from you after you cut contact. Not the obvious outbursts or dramatic reactions, but the subtle psychological moves, the unspoken expectations, and the emotional traps they hope you'll fall back into. Because your silence, to them, is not peace. It's a challenge. When you go no contact, something shifts in their perception. They may not respond immediately. There might be no direct confrontation. Instead, there are small signals, almost invisible ones. A story viewed, a post liked, a vague message, a sudden memory-triggering quote. Even silence itself can be used as bait, because what they are really looking for is not conversation. It's confirmation. Confirmation that they still have access to your emotional world. To a narcissist, your silence is not closure. It feels like a loss of control, and control is what they rely on more than anything else. They don't just feed on love or hate. They feed on attention, emotional reaction, and psychological engagement. When you remove yourself completely, it feels to them like the supply has been cut off, and that discomfort pushes them into action. So what happens next is testing. At first, it's subtle. They might simply watch you from a distance. Then they may begin indirect moves, viewing your content without speaking, posting something designed to get your attention, or asking mutual connections about you. None of it is random. It's all intentional probing. They are checking one thing. Do you still react? Because even a small reaction tells them the connection is not fully broken. It tells them there is still emotional access. And if they can't get a direct response from you, they will settle for something else, your thoughts. They want you thinking about them, wondering about them, replaying the past, checking their life, trying to decode their silence, feeling unsettled by their absence. Because in their mindset, emotional disturbance equals connection. They don't necessarily need your message. They need your attention, even if it exists only inside your mind. This is why no contact often becomes a psychological game for them. If direct contact doesn't work, they switch to indirect influence. If words don't reach you, they try actions that trigger emotion. A new post, a new relationship shown publicly, a sudden disappearance, a carefully timed reminder of shared memories. It's not always about moving on. It's about staying relevant in your emotional space. Because if you are still emotionally affected, they believe they still matter. And if they still matter, they still hold influence. But there's another layer to this. Sometimes, their silence is also designed to create doubt in you. They want you questioning yourself, wondering why they haven't reached out, asking yourself if you mattered at all, if you were forgotten, if the connection meant anything. That uncertainty is intentional, because confusion weakens resolve. And when doubt grows strong enough, many people break no contact themselves, not because they want to return, but because they want relief from the confusion. And the moment you reach out, even once, they see it as control regained. They expect this cycle. Many of them rely on it. Deep down, they assume you won't last forever without contact. They expect emotional relapse. They expect curiosity to win over boundaries. And if direct access fails, they often shift into narrative control. Suddenly, they may portray themselves as the one who was wronged, They may twist the story so that you appear as the distant one, the cold one, the one who abandoned things without effort. This reversal serves a purpose. It protects their ego while also planting seeds of doubt in your mind. Because once you start questioning your own role, your emotional boundaries begin to weaken. You replay conversations. You analyze old arguments. You start asking yourself where things went wrong, what you could have done differently, whether you were too harsh or whether you misunderstood them entirely. And in that mental loop, they still occupy space inside you. But here is what's important to understand. Every day you stay in no contact, every day you do not react, every day you resist the pull, you are not just ignoring them. You are slowly breaking the cycle. You are taking back mental space that was never truly free before. And while they may try to rewrite the story, test your boundaries, or pull you back into emotional confusion, the most powerful shift happens when you stop participating entirely. Because the moment you stop reacting, stop explaining, stop emotionally engaging, the system they rely on begins to collapse. And that is where your real freedom starts. Not in what they do next, but in what you no longer allow to affect you. They want exactly that, to keep you caught in a loop of emotional confusion until you slowly lose sight of why you chose no contact in the first place. They want your mind drifting back to the highlights, the laughter, the affection, the charm, the moments that felt warm and real. They want those memories to rise above everything painful that came with them. The manipulation, the inconsistency, the disrespect, the emotional exhaustion. And once that shift begins, a quiet thought often slips in. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe I left too soon. That is where the real danger begins, not in what they say, but in what you start to question. Because that doubt becomes a backdoor, a subtle opening, and if even a small seed of guilt is planted, it can grow into something heavier: obligation, hesitation, and eventually contact, a message, an explanation, a reopening of access. This is also where emotional awareness becomes important. Narcissists often gravitate toward people with empathy, patience, and emotional depth, not because those traits are wrong, but because they can be leveraged. And when guilt doesn't bring you back, they may shift tactics. They might not confront you directly. Instead, they may act wounded, misunderstood, or abandoned, sometimes through indirect signals, social media posts, shared acquaintances, or carefully timed silence designed to trigger your conscience. It's a form of influence without contact, and it often becomes more effective when you're still healing, because healing is where emotions are most sensitive. They understand something very important. Guilt can override logic, so they don't always try to pull you back with love. Sometimes they pull you back with responsibility. They don't just want your affection, they want your emotional energy, your internal conflict, those quiet moments where you lie awake replaying everything, questioning yourself, wondering if you were too harsh, too sensitive, or unfair. That internal struggle is exactly where they want your attention to stay. They don't always need to speak to you directly. They just need to stay active inside your mind. Because in their perception, if they are still being thought about, they are still connected to you in some way. And that is enough to feel like control hasn't been fully lost. If direct contact doesn't work, they often shift into indirect influence, subtle reminders, strategic posts, sudden changes in behavior, or even showing indifference in a way that feels deliberate. Not all of it is progress. Much of it is psychological positioning. The goal is not connection, it's attention. Because even negative attention still confirms that they occupy space in your emotional world. And when you begin replaying conversations, analyzing old arguments, or checking their life from a distance, that's when the cycle quietly continues without a single word being exchanged. That lingering focus is still energy, still engagement, still connection in their eyes. And that's why no contact can feel so mentally heavy at first. Not because you're doing it wrong, but because your mind is detaching from something it was conditioned to track. But every time you resist the urge to check, to analyze, to respond, or to explain, You weaken that conditioning. You slowly replace their voice with your own. You stop asking, what did they mean by that? And start asking, what do I need to feel stable again? You stop measuring your worth through their perception and start rebuilding your sense of clarity from within. Because narcissistic dynamics only thrive in emotional chaos, in uncertainty, in reaction, in confusion. And the more you step into clarity, the less space that dynamic has to survive. Your silence is not emptiness. It is restructuring. It is your nervous system learning that peace does not require explanation. And slowly, something begins to shift. The thoughts that once revolved around them begin to lose intensity. The urge to check fades. The emotional urgency softens. And what returns is not the version of you that was reactive or entangled, but the version that is observant, grounded, and no longer easily pulled into emotional turbulence. That is the outcome they don't prepare for, because what they expect is reaction. What they rely on is emotional availability. What they assume is that the cycle will eventually restart. But what breaks the pattern is indifference, not anger, not revenge, not confrontation, just distance without emotional charge. And that is what makes their influence collapse over time. Because when there is no longer reaction to feed on, the pattern loses structure. At that point, their attempts, whether direct or indirect, stop having the same effect. Their silence becomes just silence. Their presence becomes irrelevant noise. Their attempts to provoke emotion no longer land. And for the first time, the balance shifts. Not because they changed, but because you stopped participating. And that is where real separation begins. Not in what they do, but in what they can no longer get from you. Eventually, narcissistic relationships often end in confusion, not closure. Not because clarity isn't possible, but because clarity would remove their leverage. They rarely provide accountability. They rarely offer explanation. Instead, they leave gaps, unfinished endings that force the mind to search for meaning. And the human mind does exactly that. It tries to solve what feels incomplete. It fills silence with interpretation. It turns absence into analysis. And in that mental search for answers, the connection continues without contact, without communication, without resolution. Sometimes even a trace of hope is left behind before they fully disappear. Not enough to comfort you, but enough to keep the door psychologically ajar. And that is where the real work begins for you, not in decoding them, but in releasing the need to decode at all. Because freedom doesn't come from understanding everything they did. It comes from no longer needing answers to move forward. Maybe they talked about a future with you. Maybe they apologized just enough to keep you emotionally uncertain. Or maybe they told you they just needed space and time. On the surface, those things can sound reasonable, even responsible, even mature. But in these dynamics, they often function differently beneath the surface. They become emotional breadcrumbs, small, incomplete signals that don't provide clarity, but instead keep your mind engaged, looping, questioning, and waiting for clarity that never fully arrives. Because once uncertainty is planted, your mind doesn't stay still. It starts doing the work automatically. You begin replaying what was said. You analyze tone, timing, pauses, and word choice. You ask yourself if there was a hidden meaning behind a sentence that seemed simple at the time. You wonder if you missed something important, something that would finally make it all make sense. And without realizing it, that mental loop becomes its own form of attachment. Not attachment through connection, but attachment through unresolved meaning. Even silence plays a powerful role in that cycle. When there is no response, no closure, no explanation, the mind doesn't interpret it as nothing. It interprets it as unfinished. And the human brain is not comfortable with unfinished emotional patterns, so it tries to complete them. You start asking why they haven't reached out, whether they ever cared, whether you were the problem, whether something still exists beneath the silence that you just can't see yet. And slowly, that absence becomes noise in your head. Not external noise, but internal noise. Constant, quiet, persistent. And in that space of unanswered questions, emotional connection doesn't always fade the way people expect it to. Instead, it lingers, it reshapes itself. It replays internally in fragments, memories, imagined conversations, interpretations of past moments that suddenly feel important again. At the same time, indirect signals can intensify this even further. A vague post, a carefully chosen photo, a song lyric, a caption that feels emotionally charged but unclear, a visible sense that they are moving on, or that they are fine, or that they are living differently now. Whether intentional or not, these things trigger interpretation. And interpretation leads to emotional activation, not because there is real communication happening, but because your mind is still engaged with meaning making. You are no longer just observing reality, you are decoding it. And that's the key point most people miss. The attachment doesn't always survive through contact. Sometimes it survives entirely through interpretation. They don't need to text you. They don't need to explain anything. They don't even need to be present in your life in any direct way. The internal replay is often enough. The memory loop, the analysis, the what did that mean cycle that restarts itself every time something reminds you of them. Over time, this internal process can feel like emotional processing, even healing. But in many cases, it's actually a continuation of the bond in a different form, because healing requires movement forward, and interpretation often keeps you circling the same emotional ground. Even nostalgia can quietly reinforce it. The mind tends to selectively highlight moments that felt intense, meaningful, or emotionally charged, while filtering out the inconsistency, confusion, or emotional instability that may have also been present. That selective memory makes the connection feel more significant than it may have been in reality. And so the past becomes slightly rewritten, not intentionally, but emotionally. That's why detachment is not just about blocking contact or avoiding communication. That is only the external layer. The deeper layer is internal. It is about gradually reducing mental engagement with what happened, what was said, what wasn't said, what was implied, and what you keep trying to extract from it. As long as your mind keeps returning there, the connection is still active, not externally, but psychologically. And from their perspective, whether consciously or not, being remembered still holds weight. Not necessarily through love or intention, but through attention, through emotional energy, through mental space. Because attention itself becomes a form of presence. Even if they are gone, if your mind is still actively analyzing them, they are still, in a sense, there. That's the part that often goes unnoticed. The relationship may be over externally, but internally, it can continue through thought patterns, emotional reactivation, and unresolved meaning loops. This is also why it can feel like you are making progress one day and then suddenly being pulled back the next. A memory, a trigger, a place, a phrase, something small can reopen the entire loop instantly. Not because you failed to heal, but because the pattern hasn't fully been replaced yet, which is why real detachment is gradual. It doesn't happen in one decision. It happens in repeated redirections of attention. At some point, the shift begins, not dramatically, but quietly. Instead of automatically analyzing, you pause. Instead of replaying conversations, you let them stay in the past without reopening them. Instead of searching for meaning in their silence, you start noticing your own reaction to that silence. And that's where something important starts to change. Because the focus slowly shifts away from them and toward you, not in a forced or motivational way, but in a practical awareness of your internal state. You begin to notice what the loop is actually doing to you, the tension it creates in your body, the distraction it causes in your daily life, the way it pulls your attention away from what is actually in front of you. And slowly, a different question starts to form. Not, what did they mean, but what is this doing to my peace? That question is a turning point because it doesn't require decoding them. It requires observing yourself. And clarity doesn't come from solving every action, silence, or ambiguous moment from the past. It comes from recognizing the cost of staying inside that mental space. Over time, something subtle but powerful happens. The need to analyze weakens. The emotional urgency softens. The internal search for answers begins to slow down. What once felt like confusion starts turning into distance. And in that distance, something more stable begins to form. Not obsession, not doubt, not emotional reactivity, but perspective. You start to see the situation less as something you need to solve and more as something you have already lived through. And that shift changes everything because healing was never about getting every answer from them. It was never about finally decoding the exact meaning behind every word, silence, or action. It was about no longer needing those answers to stay emotionally free. And when that shift fully settles in, the emotional weight they once held in your mind naturally begins to lose its influence. Not because everything is understood, but because you are no longer participating in the loop that required understanding in the first place. In the end, what you begin to understand is that no contact was never just about cutting communication. It was about breaking a cycle that was designed to keep you emotionally engaged long after the relationship ended. Because narcissistic dynamics don't always survive through presence. They often survive through absence, through memory, through unanswered questions, through the mind repeatedly returning to what happened, what didn't happen, and what might have been. And that is why the final stage of detachment is not physical. It is internal. It is the moment you stop trying to decode every silence. The moment you stop assigning meaning to every post, every delay, every vague gesture from the past. The moment you recognize that clarity was never hidden from you, it was just being searched for in the wrong place. Real clarity begins when you stop participating in the mental replay, when the conversations in your head begin to quiet down, when the urge to check, to analyze, to interpret slowly loses its urgency. Because as long as your attention remains tied to them, even indirectly, some part of that emotional connection continues to exist, not because they are actively controlling you, but because the loop is still being fed internally through thought, memory, and interpretation. But the shift happens when you begin redirecting that attention back to yourself. Not in anger, not in revenge, not in proving a point, but in choosing peace over psychological engagement. That is where the real transformation begins. You stop asking, why did they do this? And start asking, why am I still carrying it? You stop measuring your worth through their actions and start rebuilding your stability through your own awareness. And slowly something powerful happens. The emotional charge begins to fade. The need for answers weakens. The internal noise that once felt constant becomes less frequent, less intense, less controlling. What remains is not confusion, but distance, perspective, clarity. And with that clarity comes a quiet realization. You were never meant to solve them. You were meant to see through the cycle and step out of it. Because narcissistic patterns only survive where there is emotional investment, reaction, and ongoing mental participation. The moment that participation stops, the pattern loses its structure. Not overnight, not instantly, but gradually as your focus returns to your own life, your own healing, your own emotional grounding. And this is where true freedom exists, not in understanding every detail of what happened, but in no longer needing those details to move forward. Eventually, their silence stops feeling like a question you need to answer. Their past present stops feeling like something you need to decode. Their influence stops feeling active in your present life. And what once felt like emotional confusion becomes something much simpler, a closed chapter that no longer defines your direction. Because in the end, the strongest form of no contact is not just the absence of them in your life, it is the absence of them in your mind. And when you reach that point, you don't just leave the cycle, you outgrow it.